At the end of every interview that we have for teacher candidates, we will say, "What questions do you have for us?" And they will always ask, "Well, what kind of support can I expect?" And we will always say, "Well, don't worry, we'll give you a mentor." But it's not real mentorship. I mean, it's support with the difficult kid or the field trip form or the grade card, but it isn't coaching. That's where partners like EdConnective step in. They provide observation and feedback with practice. That's real coaching. Their mission is to ensure that every student thrives by facilitating exceptional educator growth. So whether it's science of reading, whether it's leadership development, whether you're trying to build the best recruitment and retention efforts, check out edconnective.com. As many of you know, I serve on the board of directors for Be the Change Volunteers, and we build schools all over the world. In fact, we build schools, teacher housing, and bathrooms all over the world in Peru, in Malawi, in India, in Rwanda, Puerto Rico, and Papua New Guinea currently. And it's an incredible experience. This is a small plug, but if you ever want to join a build, just let me know. But one thing to be mindful about is when we return home after a build. You've just seen a lot, you've experienced a lot, and there's this transition back to your, regularly scheduled programming. And when I was speaking with my guest today, she highlighted the importance of preparing employees for when they are relocated to another country. And I saw it was really complimentary to what I know about superintendents and leaders who leave their community and move to another community, and sometimes in another state. Brenda Harrington is my guest, and in part one, we talk about her book, Access Denied, which seeks to support the trailblazers in your organization, the one and often the only in a workspace, and the importance for peers to be aware of that cultural field that they create, that they curate, and that they permit to persist. And then in part two, we talk about an area of Brenda's expertise that many leaders, I think, will relate to. The need to move to a new community and sometimes that new state. And you'll hear my initial confusion because she talks about global mobility and I really wasn't totally tuned in on what that meant. Brenda talks about the coaching needed before a leader changes locations and also the call to companies. And I put organizations like school boards in there to really think about an employee's success. It's a great episode. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Peter Stiefelman, and this is An Imperfect Leader. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Brenda Harrington is my guest. And Brenda is the CEO and founder of Adaptive Leadership Strategies, a service business that offers coaching and consulting solutions to help companies develop and grow talent. In addition to Brenda's work as a CEO, she's also an author. And we're going to ask her about her book, Access Denied, in a moment. But first, I think we should do a proper welcome. So, Brenda, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Hello, Peter. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so pleased to meet you. And in previous episodes of An Imperfect Leader, we've talked about succession planning. Tricia Kosanda, for example, in Illinois, she spoke about making sure that strong leaders know of your desire to see them being promoted within your system. And you'll often hear us talk about human-centered leadership, which I believe actually complements your work around authentic leadership. And in everything I've read about you, it all boils down to mentorship and coaching. And in your book, you address this. It's really deeply personal for you. And so I wonder, maybe we could start there. If you would just maybe tell us a little bit about Access Denied and then some lessons that you learned while writing the book.
Yes, thank you for that. Well, I definitely think that mentoring and coaching is a significant component of career development. And I applaud you for peeling back the layers, if you will, on the topic of succession planning. You'd be surprised, and maybe you wouldn't, in how many organizations don't really think about pipeline, right? So people are not in any way prepared for their what's next. Access Denied was my way of starting a conversation about the real life experiences of Black professionals, primarily Black women. I was really impacted in many different ways by the events of the spring of 2020. And I interpreted that as a call to action. And I really thought long and hard about what I could do to contribute to our moving the conversation forward in a meaningful way. And that was when I decided to write the book. It's a compilation of stories, about 12 stories, each of which is an archetype for the types of things that Black professionals are confronted with on a regular basis, right? But more than telling the stories, I wanted to provide tools. I wanted to provide reflection and coaching resources for people who find themselves in those stories, who see themselves in those stories, and to help them to consider alternative responses, approaches, preparation, and all of those things. People ask me who the audience is for the book, Peter, and I always speak in terms of two audiences. First, it's the people who are being impacted by some of the types of circumstances described in the book. But the secondary audience is all other people. It's an opportunity to create awareness and hopefully help people understand in a more meaningful way what others are experiencing just in the course of trying to make a living.
Would you tell us one story that comes to mind that you think, and I ask you this question because I think about the different individuals, leaders of color who I've had the privilege to work with, and how often they are the only, and then they certainly then become sort of, they're sought out as like the spokesperson for all, right? Which is so unfair for one's experience to then be, sort of generalized for everyone's experience. And I'm sort of curious what stories might, one story that might resonate for those who would absolutely should pick up your book.
Well, you touched on something very important right there, and it's the experience of being the only, right? And really that being so conspicuous across so many levels, from the standpoint of other people's assessment about, why you're there, how you got there, being exposed to things that may or may not be appropriate for a workplace conversation, but that are triggers for you or, amplify your otherness, I'll say. There's a story in the book about being at a retreat, for example, as the only, and being exposed to a conversation that touches on slavery at an executive professional retreat. And you could imagine, just the things the feelings and everything else that come along with that.
Sure. I mean, I think about Florida right now. Leaders in Florida and teachers in Florida are having to grapple with a change to the curriculum that suggests in some way that enslaved humans were taught some valuable skills and that they're supposed to then tell children that. And so I can only imagine how that might feel for an adult who is now sitting at a retreat with others who may be saying similarly ignorant things.
Exactly. And, you're sitting there among what you perceive to be your peers, and all of a sudden you're not, right? There's a hard distinction drawn between you and others. So there are a lot of things like that are not that unusual that get in the way of why everybody shows up, right? To work toward common objectives and to add value.
So for those who are listening, I would really urge you as a school leader to pick up, obviously, Brenda's book. And I'd also encourage you to look at LaGarrett King's work. Dr. King at the University of Buffalo in New York, he leads a center. They have an annual conference each summer on how to teach African-American history. And it is certainly for those who are teaching, as well as for those who are not teaching that class, as a way to better understand and be able to then integrate within their own curriculum. So please take a look at the University of Buffalo. In my own book, An Imperfect Leader, Human-Centered Leadership in After Action, and in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension. It's called leaders learning work. And that's really like the mind of an organization's work. And inside that dimension, there's a term, supporting resilience. And you wrote, we cannot change the hearts and minds of those with biases that do not favor us. We can make choices to better protect and advocate for ourselves and each other. That's a statement not to take lightly. I mean, there's real weight to that. And when I read this, I felt like you were really talking about resilience. I wonder if you'd unpack that statement for us and more importantly, talk about how leaders can support their colleagues and themselves in systems that can be quite oppressive.
Yeah, thank you for that. It is in part about resilience, but it is also about setting realistic expectations and being willing to be more strategic. We come into environments thinking that our credentials and our experience will speak for us, okay? And there's nothing more important for anyone, but particularly for the underrepresented employees in the workforce to really read the room, understand the culture, be realistic about what's possible, know who the power players are. It's like playing chess, right? Really understanding what moves you can and cannot make, focusing on what behavior is tolerated, what type of behavior is rewarded. And we don't often do that. We are in a very emotional place. You know, I've achieved this level of academic excellence, and I've gotten this certification, and I've got these many years experience. It's so much more than that, particularly for Black women and professionals of color. It really is. And so what I mean by that statement is that we've got to look through a different lens to prepare ourselves, because people waste a lot of time, I mean years, just trying to fix something that's not fixable, right? And I think if we do a reset and are willing to look at things a little bit differently, we might achieve different outcomes.
I think I understand in that you're maybe suggesting that individuals are working in what were from the very beginning imperfect systems, and then they're trying to apply what seems rational and reasonable to an imperfect and unfair system. And so it sounds like you're suggesting or urging leaders and leaders of color to think about those leverage points, to get a beat of the system and then seek those leverage points on where is the power, what is prioritized here, what is valued, and then use that to their advantage.
There's a passage in the book that I talk about our relationship with the F word, and I'm referring to the word fair, okay? Because fairness for you, Peter, and fairness for me are two very different things. And so to think that we have the opportunity to change it, in my opinion, is a fool's errand, okay? We have to be very realistic about what we're working with, and particularly in the environment that we're in right now, particularly in the academic space. And so you really have to be willing to play the hand that you're dealt.
I'd like to ask you a question that I ask every guest who comes on the program. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
It resonates because whenever you think about leadership, to use a term like perfect leadership or leadership perfection, to me is an oxymoron, okay? We're talking about interaction between human beings, and there's no place for the word perfection in that. I would argue that for people who are focused on perfection, they're missing the opportunity to achieve leadership effectiveness, because you're not leading anything if people are not lining up with you or behind you. And that's all about relationships and credibility and trust. Okay, so it's not about being perfect. All right, there is no destination. It's about how you can really establish and sustain those meaningful connections with people for them to achieve the outcomes, the desired outcomes.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being, and I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of an imperfect leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader, called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And my guest is Brenda Harrington, the CEO and founder of Adapted Leadership Strategies. And in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision they've made, and then we discuss it. So, Brenda, what happened?
What happened? Wow. This is traumatic, Peter. It's so traumatic. I don't believe you're taking me here. No.
Listeners, you can't see her, but she's in the corner now. In a fetal position. Right, exactly.
At the very beginning, when I was starting the practice, I was very enthusiastic and I'll say passionate about really focusing on an area that was very important to me. Over the course of 30 years or so, I've done a lot of work in the global mobility space, and I really wanted to provide coaching services and support for people who were preparing for expatriate experiences. There's a lot of research and data to demonstrate that the number one and number two cause of expatriate assignment failure is a lack of preparedness, both for the transferee, the employee who's being transferred, and for their spouse, significant other, and for their families. And I really spent a lot of time and energy based on that research, figuring out and working on how I could serve that populace. What I didn't understand was that for most large organizations, most corporations, it's a cost of doing business. We sent Peter to Prague. It didn't work out. That's a shame. And they move on. And so the awareness for me, and the sadness, I will say at the same time, was the extent to which large organizations, for the most part, large corporations, had commoditized human capital, had commoditized talent. All right. And so it took me a long time to kind of unravel that, pivot, and course correct, but I did. And what came out of that was my ability to find my way to a space that was more accepting of the types of things that I was interested in doing. And that's more in economic development, humanitarian aid, and places areas that value human development a bit more.
So if I understand correctly, as you're describing the building of your firm, that you have this wealth of experience with global mobility. And at first I was thinking to myself, what is that? And then as you described it, I'm like, oh, okay, we're talking about multinational companies that send their employees all over the world.
Moving to other countries, yes.
Gotcha, yep. And that there is this sort of expectation of this is the price of doing business when it doesn't work out. And yet how disruptive that is, not only for the employee who has picked up and moved to another country, but also for their family and their children. And that can be incredibly taxing on the relationship of that family. And so that may be the cost of doing business for the corporation, but that certainly is destructive and damaging for individuals as humans. And so as you were then moving towards what kind of firm am I creating, you wanted to look more about the things that you value, economic development, and the human side around leadership and the human side of developing people. And so as you were working on creating this, and did I capture that right? Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. That was perfect. And the reality is that, it's those moves can be profoundly traumatic for everyone involved. And it really doesn't take much. There's such a broad brush approach to, I don't even want to use the term preparing people, but, giving people the tools, if you will, to execute on the business purpose. And there's little attention given to, what's important for the person. And ironically, some of the most profound failures, you think, oh, okay, I'm going to move to the UK. They speak English. I speak English. How hard could it be? And that's where things, those circumstances where people take it for granted can be the most challenging.
So then as you were starting your business, what do you believe you sort of overlooked as you were creating this new firm with very focused goal and mission?
Yeah, the fact that corporations aren't willing to pay for it. It's not a line item, right? It's not something that they consider an economic priority. That's why I said it's the cost of doing business. And, throw it up against the wall. If it works out, that's great. Congratulations. If not, so sorry it didn't work. And I can't tell you the extent to which that happens and changes lives.
How curious. Schools are always told and school districts are told, if you just applied a more business model to the work that you do, you'd be more successful. And yet I'm thinking throwing spaghetti against the wall is probably not what they meant.
Not that one. Yeah, not that one.
Well, but I think about, so if you compare this to children who are changing schools or teachers who are changing communities or leaders who are coming from a large urban metropolitan district who are now leading suburban or rural districts. And there is a difference in approach and perspective and a set of values that if they don't get a beat on the system and begin making change through this sense of urgency and the sort of impulsive moves, that can really be destructive for the institution as well as whatever goals they've set for themselves and their district. So I think there's a lot of similarity in this work.
No question. You have to understand the culture, and you can't. I always say, well, I'm in the DC metropolitan area, so I said you can't take what you did on K Street to Qatar and expect it to work. People don't care what you did in Washington DC, and you can quickly offend someone and interfere, with the business purpose. So yeah.
What did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships were formed?
Well, I have to say that in going through that, I learned a lot about my own leadership competencies. There were a number of people that were willing to come with me on this journey, right, and contribute to what we were trying to create. And that was a very meaningful experience for me. I'll never forget. And it taught me a lot about the importance of values in relationships. And I think that applies both professionally and personally. People often look the other way, even when they feel their values are being assaulted. And I know sometimes it can be frightening to really hold the line on the things that are most important to you.
There's nothing more important than your personal values and having those values really guide you in the decisions you make, and whether or not you apply for a job, whether or not you stay with a company, or when you're being asked to do something that may compromise those values, being able to have the courage to take a stand, which
where you spend your time. Yeah.
It's easy to say, but it's hard to do.
Hard to do. Yeah.
What frustrated you?
Probably the same, I would say, Peter. What frustrated me was the realization pretty much across the board that this was just not something that was considered important or in any way meaningful, not by most HR departments, not by many, mobility departments, not by a lot of people who were involved in this process. The sequence of events, and I won't take you through that, brings the people, in my opinion, who have the most to contribute to the process in at the very end. And so overlooking that was what was missing for me. And I should have paid more attention to that. I got so caught up, honestly. I was so enthusiastic and so excited about doing this work, or taking the work I had been doing to the next level. I didn't realize that the discrete opportunities that I had had successfully to do some of these things, which led me to this place, were really exceptions. And I needed to really zoom out and cast a wider net.
So that's interesting. I really feel like you're answering this question and the next. So let me see if I understand. And because it sounds like when you were doing this work, you were mindful of the people most impacted by that decision. And so when you thought you would go work with other firms and create your own and then support other corporations who were doing this work, you recognized or realized, oh, I was the exception. I was doing exceptional work for the people most impacted, but others don't prioritize that work.
Others don't prioritize it. The way in is what made the difference. So there were a few instances, where I might have been brought in by the P&L owner, the person who had the budget responsibility. That could have been a chief operating officer, could have been a senior vice president, depending on the organization, who had financial responsibility for the outcomes of that particular assignment or the person, things like that. And so that person had a vested interest. Peter, I want you to go to Prague, and here's what I'm sending you to do. And it's really important that you achieve this goal for the organization. That's different than having a conversation with someone that doesn't have that vested interest. Not that they shouldn't, but when you go in, say, and have a conversation on the front end with a human resource person or a talent management person, they're not there. That's not part of their charge. And that's what I meant by they're coming in at the end of the process, right? So it's a different conversation. So my perception was, wow, this worked great for this person. We were able to support this family and help them to be successful. And then we did it over here and we did it over here. But the entry was through a different relationship.
In the end, what would you say is something that was good that has come out of this experience?
What was good is that it really compelled me to really get to the type of work that I wanted to do, and work that I could not have imagined doing, that has been tremendously, I'll say, impactful, if I can, and gratifying for me personally, that I might not have found my way to had I not gone through this experience.
I think that's really important lesson for all of us, right? That we sometimes have an expectation of what life will be. And as leaders, we are uncomfortable with the unresolved or the unknown. And often that will point us in a really fruitful and wonderful direction. And so it sounds like that has been the case for you.
And I just want to go back to your question earlier about the imperfect leader, right? Because the educators, we learn by making mistakes, right? We learn by making mistakes, as uncomfortable and painful and awkward as it can be, right? But some of those mistakes are really a gateway. And if we allow ourselves to settle into that space, and reconsider, like I said, look through a different lens, we can really get to different outcomes.
My guest today was Brenda Harrington, the CEO and founder of Adaptive Leadership Strategies and the author of Access Denied. We'll put a link to the book in our show notes. And today we really have learned a lot. We've learned about the experiences of those trailblazers within our own organizations that are blazing a path and a path for themselves and a path for others to follow. And we've learned how really I think that leaders should and can support those trailblazers so that they're not walking or leading alone. Brenda, thank you for constantly wanting to send me to Prague. And thank you so much for being on An Imperfect Leader. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print-inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader. I'm Peter Stiepelman. Please join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action. Imperfect leaders. Are you facing challenges filling open speech-language pathologist positions within your district? It's kind of a silly question because I know you are. Empath Speech understands the critical need for qualified professionals in your schools. They recognize that communication lies at the heart of academic success, and that's why they're dedicated to helping you bridge the gap by offering expert therapists and innovative telehealth solutions. Don't let open positions hinder your students' success. Partner with Empath Speech today and ensure every child in your district has access to the speech therapy they deserve. Empath Speech, EMPAT Speech.com. Empowering students, empowering schools.